We always talk about the Germans and all the atrocities that committed. But if you take every horrendous act that you have ever heard of coming from the German side, the Japanese did exactly the same and worse. And you probably never heard of it. So allow me to enlighten you. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. They ate people. Yes, the Japanese were cannibals. Candace Owens has been undergoing an awakening. I appreciate that she has become more interested in and willing to consider things that would be considered controversial. However, I believe she is incredibly ignorant about the nature of the Pacific War during World War II. Was the use of atomic bombs in World War II justified? Well, both Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens have taken a hard stance. I believe that their stance ignores the local politics and culture of Imperial Japan. An honest assessment of the facts I'm going to present will make it clear that when it comes to World War II, at least, there are no easy answers. And Candace, of course, later in the video makes a comparison between the current conflict in Israel and what happened to the Japanese during World War II. Now, I understand on the surface level why she believes this is a fair comparison. I'm also going to explain why it's wrong.
And I don't think there's any greater example of that than World War II. I mean, think about the way that you react now to the concept of World War II still, many years after your public school training. We have an almost visceral response that has been embedded in us, even regarding something like German accents. I realize this. Every movie that I watched growing up, every time you talk about Germans in the classroom, they are the bad guy.
So if you think back to every movie you've ever seen about World War II, every German, every Russian, yeah, they were the bad guys, of course. But what do you remember about the Japanese? You see, history's been a little bit kinder to the Japanese because we see them as victims because of the bombs. So we don't like to go into what they did to deserve it. And yes, I believe they deserved it, and I believe that there was no other path other than dropping the bombs. Am I saying it's good? No. That's a step too far. It's not good to kill people, but sometimes it is necessary and unavoidable.
Yeah, that is kind of what I have recognized about my public school training. And if you need more proof of that, look no further than the bizarre public defense that people make regarding dropping atomic bombs. Yes, incinerating hundreds of thousands of human beings. And people will defend it just like that.
Just like that, she says. As if it's that easy. As if all these historians who have been arguing for decades about whether the bombs were justified or not, they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, just like that, it was worth it. Come on, Candace, don't be lazy. This kind of moral superiority is the thing that you would expect from your former employers, not you. I may have said too much.
Recently, Tucker appeared on Joe Rogan. I've been showing clips of that. It was a phenomenal conversation. You should go pursue it in its entirety. But he begins talking about dropping atom bombs and says something that I think is quite sensible. Take a listen.
On the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like, it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me.
Yeah. I fully agree with his statement. If you find yourself defending dropping nuclear bombs on innocent civilians, you are not on the side of goodness.
So my first counter to this nonsense is the idea that nuclear bombs are somehow inherently worse than any other kind of bombing. And it's just not true. You've been propagandized to believe that nuclear bombs are worse, but At the end of the day, dead people are dead people. You drop a bomb, you drop 100 bombs, or you drop one nuclear bomb. Now, if you want to say that anyone who drops bombs on anyone ever is prima facie evil, as Tucker stated, then you can have that opinion and you can argue it as you wish. But I don't think either of them believe that. If you were to use an atomic bomb to, say, purposefully irradiate an area, which is not what we did, then yeah, I would agree that is evil, because there's no reason to do that. We purposefully detonated the nuclear bombs high enough so that there would be no radioactive or minimal radioactive fallout. And of course, people live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki today, which would not be possible had we decided to really drop the hammer on them in an actually evil way. But the second point that I have for this is this hand waving, oh yeah, well, it could have been some savings and this and that. I don't believe either of them have any idea the depths of depravity that the Japanese were up to in that region for a very, very long time, and why the U.S. actually got involved in the war.
The atrocities it committed in Nanjing were known worldwide as the Rape of Nanking. The Imperial Japanese military slaughtered around 300,000 unarmed individuals. This atrocity and others gave the Roosevelt administration the support they needed to act. In 1938, the president passed a non-binding embargo on Japan, encouraging companies to avoid selling to Tokyo.
Most people think of the war as a European-centric war. But if you look at the entire scope of conflict in Europe and Asia, World War II began with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and ended when the Russians pushed them out of Manchuria and the US dropped the atomic bombs at the same time. It took both. One by itself would not create surrender. Let's look at what the men from the World War II Heritage Foundation, let's see what they have to say.
I know plenty of people, as I'm sure many of you do, who were involved in training for the invasion of Japan, who say, thank God for the atomic bomb. One of those people whom I particularly cherish knowing was the actor Paul Newman, who was the bombardier on a two-man Navy plane training for the invasion. He told me after I was saying something about using the bomb, he said, well, I was one of those guys who said, thank God, because I got to go home in one piece. There is that side of the story.
This is one of my biggest issues with conversations around war in general, when you have to talk to women and feminine men. Sorry, Tucker, but a rose by any other name would still be a simp. The problem is when you talk about innocence. So last time I checked, if you're attacked and you're peaceful and you did nothing to provoke that attack, you're innocent. So when an innocent person defends themselves, they are still innocent. Now there is a line that you can cross that you are no longer innocent. Of course. So the question is, where is that line? Now, if you're dealing with a suicidal death cult who say civilian lives don't matter at all, in fact, we're willing to burn, rape, pillage, murder, torture, and experiment on anyone we feel like because we are the superior race. Sound familiar? Where is that line? Now, in Europe, the line seems to be pretty clear. We had to defeat the Nazis by any means necessary. If we had dropped nukes on the Nazis, we probably wouldn't be having the same conversation about Japan. My problem when people mention innocence in war is that they always ignore the men, as if only women and children, people who are just going about their day-to-day life buying groceries, those are the only people that matter. But what about the man who was just minding his own business and got the call? to defend his brothers, his sisters, his countrymen, that man is innocent. He is acting to defend others. But you don't consider him innocent. You don't think about his life, the fact that he would have had to be on the front lines, invading Japan in order to stop what the Japanese were doing. You can't sit back and say, oh, well, the war would have ended. No, there is no evidence of that.
I had thought that Hasegawa's book basically said that it was the decision of the Soviet Union to invade that left the Japanese aware that they were surrounded on two sides by large and powerful armies, that led to the decision by the Japanese military to agree to unconditional surrender. But evidently what Hasegawa in fact says is that the bomb was one part of that story. Japanese would not surrender when by all conventional terms of war fighting they had lost. They were down to about 1,000 calories per person of buckwheat and weeds per person in Japan. They were without an air force. They were without a navy. Their home islands had been blockaded. There was just simply no reason for them to continue fighting from a Western point of view. But it was a more intimate part of Japanese culture, perhaps, that led, well, it was the Japanese military leadership that didn't care how many civilians got killed along the way, if truth be told, that led them to hope that when the invasion inevitably came, there would be enough blooding of American forces that the United States would soften its position about unconditional surrender.
I tend to trust their opinion more than yours, Candace. More than yours, Tucker. Because they care more about life in general than just female and child life. We always talk about the Germans and all the atrocities that committed. But if you take every horrendous act that you have ever heard of coming from the German side, the Japanese did exactly the same and worse. And you probably never heard of it. So allow me to enlighten you.
It was the Nanjing Massacre, where the marauding Japanese army killed between 40,000 and 300,000 people. After killing and capturing nearly all military-aged men, the Japanese soldiers persecuted one of the worst incidences of mass rape in human history. In some cases, women were literally raped to death. The marauding soldiers' favorite targets were high schools. Many other massacres were carried out in China as part of the 3 alls policy: kill all, loot all, burn all. One of Unit 731's goals was to develop a pathogen they could use to wage biological warfare on Americans. The unit's chief, General Ishii, planned to airdrop plague-carrying fleas into the western United States to cause a pandemic.
Now, Candace mentions that Eisenhower, along with several other people, military figures, believed that Japan was on the verge of surrender. But they didn't really understand the Japanese, at least not as closely as someone like Joseph Grew, ambassador to Japan, who spent several years living there and understood the Japanese very closely. Here's what he had to say. I know Japan. I've lived there for 10 years. I know the Japanese intimately. The Japanese will not crack. They will not crack morally or psychologically or economically, even when eventual defeat stares them in the face. They will pull in their belts another notch, reduce their rations from a bowl to a half a bowl of rice, and fight to the bitter end. Only by utter physical destruction and utter exhaustion of their men and materials can they be defeated.
All right, there are also what I view as major flaws in the revisionist position. First of all, and we now have a lot more Japanese sources than we had before the emperor died in the late 1980s, and scholars who have who are able to use the Japanese sources, and these are not scholars who were necessarily or in any way supportive of the use of the bomb or fans of Harry Truman, but they have concluded from Japanese sources that the Japanese were not ready to surrender, that they had not decided to surrender, that the Japanese had not reached a point where they had decided to surrender. And that knocks out a major crutch of the revisionist position because it's based on the argument that the Japanese were trying to surrender. The Japanese sources, and from what we know of other sources, indicates that simply was not the case. And scholars who have used Japanese sources also indicate that even if we had offered to guarantee the status of the emperor, even if we had made a statement to Japan in the Potsdam Proclamation or in some other context, we're going to allow the emperor to remain, that this would have convinced the Japanese to surrender, and that again has been a major part of the revisionist argument. If only we had assured the Japanese that they could keep the emperor, then Japan would have surrendered. Japanese sources seem to indicate otherwise.
So instead of moral grandstanding, maybe put yourself in Truman's shoes. Imagine you have this bomb that could possibly end the war, and you decide not to use it. And instead, 50,000 Americans die from the plague on the West Coast. Or 50,000 servicemen die invading Japan. Maybe more. Maybe both. Are you willing to take that risk? Are you willing to stand before the American people and say, I was worried about hurting civilians, so I let 100,000 American civilians die? 50,000 American civilians? 10? Where is your line? If you can't tell us where the line is for you, then all you're doing is grandstanding. You have no actual principles that you're standing on. Because if you did, the firebombing of Tokyo would be your first priority to talk about instead of the atomic bomb, because the firebombing of Tokyo killed more people. As you said, incinerated civilians.
These bombs were not more destructive than the equivalent firebombing campaigns that had preceded them. The most destructive attack on Japan wasn't Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the first big firebombing of Tokyo in, I think, April of 45. March, when at least 150,000 people died, and there are estimates of casualties up around the 500,000 mark, and I mean seriously injured casualties. Or you can look, of course, at Dresden or Hamburg or the cities in Europe. So, and the bomb was deliberately designed to explode high enough in the air, deliberately triggered to explode high enough in the air that it would not churn up soil with its fireball and make a lot of radioactivity. The assumption was that the prompt radioactivity of the fireball would kill people who would have been killed by blast anyway. Whether that actually worked out quite that way, I don't think it did. But the point is, there was every effort made to make this bomb as conventional in its effects as possible, which tells you again the general thinking that this, from a military point of view, is just another weapon of war, which is kind of, I think, what President Truman was doing when he really never quite decided to use it. He just released it for the military's use and any subsequent weapons of its type.
And there are still lots of questions that are debated among scholars. Certainly, at least to my knowledge, there is no consensus of opinion on a lot of secondary issues. But there are on the main issues, and that is that the bomb was necessary to end the war as quickly as possible, that the Soviet invasion was also a major influence. The bomb and the Soviet invasion combined were essential to force the Japanese to surrender promptly.
So to summarize, according to Tucker and Candace, there is no justification for nuclear warfare. So I have to ask you, Candace, how would you have stopped the Japanese? Now you can't say, oh, just conventional warfare, because we firebombed Tokyo and killed more people in that bombing than we did in the 2 atomic bombs put together. Okay, so you can't say, well, just go home, because as I've shown you, they were ready to send a plague to the U.S., even if they didn't send an army. And just to double down on that point, 3 times before we dropped the atomic bomb, the Japanese attempted to use biological warfare on American troops and on the American homeland itself. They sent plague-ridden submarines to attack the west coast of the U.S. This is not a hypothetical. They tried to do this, and they would have continued to try to do this if we had not dropped those bombs. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. They ate people. Yes, the Japanese were cannibals.
Without any warning, the Japanese began a program of cannibalization of their Indian prisoners. Ram first witnessed an incident of cannibalism on the 12th of November 1944, when a Kempeitai officer beheaded a recently captured Allied pilot. I saw this from behind a tree, recalled Ram, who then witnessed an appalling act of butchery take place as the Japanese soldiers present began to render the young pilot's body into food.
And what do you think would have happened to the Chinese that were being raped and tortured and killed during that time if we just decided to walk away? No. They were a menace, and they acted more like a suicidal death cult than a country. And that's why it's my assertion that not only was the bomb dropping justified, but necessary. Because when Candace talks about innocence, the truth is, in my opinion, the only innocent people in the entirety of Japan were either in jail or children. Now, don't you think that changes a little bit the calculus of where you decide to drop bombs? I would hope so.